Hi, I'm Mike Sheehy, Cloud Transformation Architect with Nutanix. In the second episode of Cloud Native Technologies with Nutanix, we're going to talk about optionality and choice. We mentioned this in our last Cloud Native demo in the last video, which you can watch here by clicking the link above. So, Nutanix Cloud Native solution provides flexibility around platform, hypervisor, Kubernetes distribution, and cloud. So you can see here that the on-prem cloud infrastructure and services, we deploy our Nutanix data services in Kubernetes distro of choice, or you can use the internal native K8 orchestration management solution we call Karbon. And you can deploy this on any hardware, whether it's Dell EMC, Cisco UCS, HPE DX or GreenLake, Lenovo or TrueScale, etc. And if you combine the services around unstructured and structured data services with a modern cloud native solution like Red Hat OpenShift, Anthos, Karbon, Azure Arc enabled Karbon services, you get a true cloud native foundation to deliver virtual machines, container services, and database as a service, along with all of these structured and unstructured data services for block, file, and object services. Secondly, we want to deploy our automation services and integrate those into our change management system with support for third-party infrastructure as code tools and configuration management. And we do this with ServiceNow through a plugin that is native to our automation solution. Through this orchestration solution, we can deliver infrastructure as code by calling Terraform Provider, as well as Ansible playbooks for configuration management. And this could all be orchestrated and plugged into ServiceNow. So the delivery of applications makes it seamless with Nutanix to deliver this cloud-like model on premises, to deliver database as a service foundation, all of the data services required, Kubernetes services, your choice of hypervisor, and your choice of infrastructure as code and configuration management. And really the most popular tools that we see today are Terraform and Ansible. And from a change management system, being able to have a single source of truth or a single portal to go through a service chain or request chain and approval chain. In the third step, you now deploy your developer and operator services. And these can be anything from Azure Arc data services, service mesh capabilities from Istio, Linkerd, Console, CI/CD services, Artifactory, Jenkins, Git, Azure DevOps, etc. And of course, telemetry with Kafka, Prometheus, etc. Very, very important to bring all this together in one cohesive solution. So essentially, we're delivering a complete foundation of infrastructure and data services with your choice of Kubernetes, database as a service, along with all of the automation plugins and change management plugins into ServiceNow. And then you have the flexibility and optionality to deploy your cloud native services that you choose, whether you use Git, Azure DevOps, etc. So we'll start with a demo of deploying the same application across different substrates. So we have a demonstration here where we're going to deploy WordPress in a containerized fashion on our Karbon Kubernetes solution built into the platform, on Google Anthos, as well as native cloud Kubernetes services such as Azure Kubernetes Service. And we're going to show you how easy and simple this is. So within Prism, we go to our Cloud Application Lifecycle Management interface, and we go to our blueprints. Before we actually jump in and deploy the application, I want to go back and show you exactly what we're doing here. So within settings, we have this idea of accounts. And these accounts are really target substrates or target areas where we deploy applications and lifecycle manage applications. You can see here I have cloud accounts to be able to deploy services within AWS or Azure. I have a Nutanix cluster on-prem. This could be a non-Nutanix cluster, it could be a VMware cluster running on 3-tier. But I also have these 3 Kubernetes solutions here. We talked about the 3 that I have set up today. There are others, but we'll focus on these today. We have Anthos from Google, AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes service running natively in Azure, as well as Karbon, which is running natively on Nutanix. The blueprints here we're actually going to deploy a WordPress application to all three of these substrates. First, we'll focus on Karbon, and we'll deploy WordPress on Karbon, and we'll show you what that looks like. So the blueprint really focuses on two components. We have the database backend, and we have the WordPress front end, which is running Apache Web Services. So let's go ahead and look at this, what this looks like. So in the deployment, you can see here, I chose the account Karbon. In reality, I can pick any three of these as I have defined in the accounts section I showed previously. We can set up the container configuration as well as the service configuration. For Karbon on-prem, I don't have a load balancer set up right now, so we're just going to deploy as a service type node port. So let's go ahead and launch this application. We'll call this Cloud Native Karbon. We'll input our MySQL password, and we'll hit deploy. So what this is doing is we're actually deploying this application in a predefined namespace that we created called WordPress. So what does that look like? So I use a tool called Lens, and Lens is a great tool to give me full visibility into my Kubernetes solutions. So in this solution, you can see here, I'm logged into Karbon. I can see my CPU memory, my pods, right? My utilization, my telemetry data. But I also have a terminal here I can actually access the Kubernetes cluster through the terminal. I also have visibility through the GUI, so I don't have to actually do this. I can actually go in here and look. So for example, if I want to do hit namespace, you can see here I have using kubectl this WordPress namespace, which I've pre-added prior to the deployment of this application. So this application will actually be deployed within the WordPress namespace. Well, this is provisioning. Let's actually go look at the Karbon cluster. So within the same interface, we can actually manage our Kubernetes clusters. You can see here I have a cluster called Final Order. And this will be important later as we talk about the capabilities within Azure as well, because I do have Final Order registered in Azure Arc as a Kubernetes service. So let's drill down into Final Order. You can see here I have an upgrade available, right? So I can actually lifecycle manage my Kubernetes solution. You can see in my versioning, the API endpoint IP address, the status is healthy, and the network provider is Calico. In this solution, I have a demo solution, so it's very small. It's a non-prod environment. So I essentially have one control plane, so a single master node, and a two worker nodes in a single node pool. So what's that look like? Let's go to nodes. Let's go to the control plane. You can see here I have a single master node, an etcd node, as well as a worker node here. And this is a worker node pool, excuse me. I can drill down into this, and I can resize this node pool and add more workers, or I could update it and actually change the node pool configuration. And I can actually add keys and tagging for the metadata. So if I drill down into this, you can see here I have two worker nodes. Well, let's go back to our application automation deployment and see where the status is. So you can see here we have Cloud Native Karbon, and it's actually running. Let's look at the deployment. And you can see here we deployed the MySQL and service as well as the Apache web service. So what does this look like? We can go into Lens, into the terminal. So you can see here, we're looking at the service within the namespace WordPress. And you can see here the deployment of WordPress as the Apache front end, as well as the WordPress MySQL database backend. And you can see the node port, it's 30530. But what is the IP address? So you can do this and get actually both pieces of information through our audit process within the deployment. So if we go down here to the publish create service and provision K8s, let's look at the audit to see exactly what the IP address is. You can see here the node port is 31364. When we go over to the service, when we pick the Apache Web Service under pod deployment, you can see here the host IP is 50.196. Let's copy this. 31364. And you can see here that we're connecting to the WordPress service that's running on Karbon. So we simply deploy the application through our application automation onto the Kubernetes cluster running on my Nutanix cluster and using the data services, the CSI driver for volumes for storage, the CNI driver with Calico, etc. You can continue on and you can configure WordPress as normal. So what does this look like for other solutions? What about a hybrid solution like Anthos? So what I mean by that is Anthos is actually deployed within our environment, and I can show you that here. We have an application that's running called Anthos. We deployed Anthos through an automation framework that we have, a blueprint that actually deploys the Anthos cluster. Then what we do is we follow the instructions here, and we get the service account secret and the secret name, and we actually register that to the GCP Anthos portal. So let's log into GCP. So we're in the GCP portal, and now we'll go to Anthos. And within Anthos, or excuse me, the Anthos portion of the portal, we can see clusters. We have a cluster that's healthy. Let's view the cluster. And you can see here I have a cluster called MS Lab Anthos. Let's click into that. And so what happens here is I can look and see and get information about the cluster size, the control plane version, the location, which is a registered cluster, how many nodes in the cluster, etc. But I can also see what features are actually enabled on the cluster. So you can manage features through here, meaning that you can set up identity service, service mesh, ingress, etc. But we can also get further details in GKE. So when we drill down to the GKE tab, we can see here we get additional details and we can drill down into our nodes. So this is actually running on the same Nutanix cluster as Karbon at this time. And so basically we're running GKE or Anthos on-prem on the Nutanix cluster, and we're providing the similar data services that we provide Karbon or any other Kubernetes solution that we support on the Nutanix platform. You can see here this solution has 3 master VMs and 2 worker nodes. And let's drill down into the storage. Within the storage, you can see the Nutanix default CSI driver that's providing storage, persistent storage, to the Anthos cluster. So let's look at deploying the same application we deployed on Karbon, the WordPress application, onto the Anthos cluster. So as we go back here into COM, we can go to Blueprints, and you can see here that we have a blueprint called COM WordPress Anthos. Let's go into that. So again, very similar. We have a MySQL backend, and we have a WordPress app. And you can see here I have the number 2. That means I'm going to deploy 2 replicas instead of 1 replica like we did in Karbon. So let's deploy 2 replicas, and we can change that. So if we go click on this, we go to Service, you can see here, under deployment, that we have 2 replicas, okay? Or we can change this to 1, or we can change this to 3. So let's just keep it at 2 so we can see that it's deploying 2 replicas. We'll hit Save. You can see the deployment here is going to Anthos. And again, you have the option to change this Anthos to AKS to Karbon. And you can see I actually went to a different blueprint. In reality, you can choose the same blueprint or have a choice to have the same blueprint. And then when you deploy, you can pick any solution, any Kubernetes solution that's actually added as an account within our application lifecycle manager. But we're going to pick Anthos, and we're going to launch this. We'll call this Cloud Native Anthos. And we'll choose our Nutanix for you. Oh, one thing I want to do before we do this, actually, let's go back to the blueprint. Let's go back to Anthos. So when we deployed Anthos, we actually set up a load balancer. So unlike the Karbon solution, where I don't have a load balancer set up, we could easily set up a load balancer, however, using Nginx or MetaLB, et cetera, et cetera. But with Anthos, right, we have a load balancer configured. So let's look at that real quick. You can see here in the service, I have the service type load balancer. So I have a block of IPs that was configured when we deployed Anthos for load balancer uh, uh, duty. So let's go back and we're going to deploy again. We're going to call this Cloud Native Anthos. Choose our MySQL password. Let deploy. And now we can see this actually deploying, and it's audit to the right. And of course, again, you can follow the status of what's going on as this actually, as the audit gets, the audit trail gets populated. So what we can do in the meantime while we're waiting is let's go back to the GCP portal within GKE. One thing I wanted to show was the workloads and the services. So you can see here I have a namespace called Wordpress, and you can see here that the deployment's already started with MySQL. And when this completes, we'll actually see 2 WordPress pods, because remember, we deployed 2 replicas in this case. Let's go back and see where we are. And you can see here we're almost done. Actually, we just finished with MySQL, and now we're moving on to the Apache front end and the 2 replicas we're going to deploy there. Let's go back to GCP portal. Let's refresh again. And you can see here that we're deploying WordPress, the front end, the Apache front end, and you can see here we have 2 pods because we have 2 replicas. This is almost completed. And it's just about completed and it's running. So this is up and running. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're again going to go to our audit log at the end for provisioning the K8 service to see exactly what the IP address is. So again, this should give us an IP out of the load balancer. You can see here the load balancer ingress IP address is 192.168.50.223. In the spec, we have this pointing to port 80 for this application. So if I just put this IP within a web browser, it defaults to port 80, and it should take me right to the WordPress application, as you can see here. So again, we deployed the same application in a hybrid solution, meaning we have an Anthos Kubernetes cluster running on-prem, which can be managed internally through how we're deploying it, as well as how we're deploying applications, or it could be managed externally. So let's look at that for a minute. So again, we're on GCP now, and again, the cluster is up, WordPress is up and running, as we know. What if we wanted to actually look at deploying applications, right? So we could actually go into the marketplace, and we can choose Anthos. And within the Anthos, we can pick any of these Anthos-enabled services to deploy onto our Anthos Kubernetes cluster. Or you could upload your own services and deploy them from here. So you don't necessarily have to use the application management tool that I showed you that we, the blueprinting, etc., via our solution built in. You still could use GCP portal if you'd like. The power of Prism, right, and the application automation is what brings this all together, right? So I don't have to go to GCP portal to deploy an application. I don't have to go to build YAML files and manually use kubectl to deploy an application. Though you could do that in any one of these solutions, right? I can build a blueprint and deploy a full set of services and applications and have it be repeatable. So next on the list is, okay, we have this application automation framework. What about Kubernetes services that run outside of Nutanix? So in the next example, we're actually going to deploy the same application, WordPress, and we're going to deploy it on the Azure Kubernetes service. So let's log into Azure Kubernetes. We'll close these WordPress windows. And you can see here I'm logged into the Azure portal under my account. Let's click on Kubernetes services. So in this case, you actually see 2 clusters. One has a blue circle underneath. This is called final order. You've seen final order because I've showed you what this is. This is actually the Karbon cluster running on Nutanix, which is our Kubernetes orchestration and management solution. So it's our Kubernetes cluster running in on Nutanix, but it's registered back to Azure Arc. And so what does this allow us to do? Well, let's go and look at Azure Arc. And within Azure Arc, you can deploy Azure services. So for example, you could do SQL managed instances, Postgres SQL Hyperscale, which is in preview. You can deploy web apps, logic apps, functions, etc. And you can do this through data controllers. All right. So essentially, what's happening is there's a controller that sits on the cluster that links us back to Azure Arc and allows us to deploy and manage SQL managed instances on Kubernetes. So imagine the power of that, right? We don't really have to deploy SQL on Windows, right? Windows is not required in the solution. We're using a fully vetted SQL solution that's been created by Microsoft that supports, they say, 99% of the capabilities as SQL running on Windows, but you can deploy this in a containerized fashion. You can also deploy PostgreSQL Hyperscale. This is in preview right now, as shown here. I don't know when this will be GA. You'll have to contact Microsoft to find that out. But you can also deploy Arc-enabled application service as well, which is also in preview. Web apps, logic apps, functions, etc. So this is becoming more popular as well. So if you want to build and deploy web applications for mobile API apps, you can actually do that. If you want to deploy workflows, through logic apps, through single lines of code, or functions as a service and API management, you can actually do that as well. Again, some of these features are in preview. I know the SQL managed instances for Azure Arc Kubernetes just became GA not too long ago, so this is actually a GA product right now. So let's go back into our Kubernetes service. Another thing I want to point out is as you click into this, you can see that we have this Karbon cluster again, which is registered. What else can we do? Well, we can actually use the services that are provided natively through Azure. So we do have customers that use our Kubernetes solution but tie it into Azure DevOps, for example, or they use Git and they use GitOps, or they deploy policies from Azure Arc into the Kubernetes solution. So again, this is a bi-directional solution, right? Meaning that I can, have an on-prem solution, deploy Microsoft services on-prem, or deploy and leverage GitOps or Azure DevOps. Or I can also use native Azure services like this second cluster that we're going to talk about now. So you can see here we have this MS Lab Azure Kubernetes service. And what this is this is a native Azure Kubernetes service running in Azure. Okay, and you can see here that I have a single node pool. Has auto scaling enabled. The node sizes are using the standard B2MS instance types. And of course, again, you can choose any instance type that you'd like. You can choose the Kubernetes version, the network type, and there's a couple of network types that plugins that and policy managers that Azure supports. I choose Calico to keep it all even across the board. And of course, there's integrations as well. So what we want to do is we want to look at the workloads, right? And you can see here we have no WordPress workload running. And let's look at the namespaces, but you can see a WordPress namespace here. And again, this was done prior to the demo where I actually created the namespace. And this could be automated too. I mean, if you wanted to, you could actually have this as an automation within the application blueprint. So for example, you may have it call Kubernetes to create a namespace prior to the actually application deployment. So let's go into the blueprint for this. Let's go deploy WordPress again, but we're going to deploy it on the Azure Kubernetes service. Again, MySQL, backend, WordPress, Apache frontend. Okay, you can see here that the deployment is AKS. I am using Azure Load Balancer that is registered to my cluster. So I am using the Azure Load Balancer service. You can see here under containers, under the service, I have Load Balancer picked. And when we deploy this, you'll see that there's going to be an external IP address that is being provided for the load balancer for port 80 for the Apache app service. You can see here port 80 right here. We can choose the amount of replicas. So in this case, we're only going to deploy a single replica for our web tier. Let's go ahead and deploy this. We'll call this Cloud Native AKS. We'll use Nutanix password. And we'll hit deploy. So this deployment should be fairly quick since I'm only using one replica. And what we'll do is we'll pause the video here and we'll bring it back as soon as it's deployed. Okay, so that's finished. Again, we're going to go back to the audit to actually find out what the IP address is. We scroll over here. We can see here the load balancer ingress IP address is this public IP. Doesn't have to be a public IP address. The only reason why I'm using a public IP address is because I don't have a VPN connection set up for Azure today, or else I would just use an internal IP address for load balancing. There you go. And so we deployed WordPress onto our Azure Kubernetes services cluster. Of course, you can continue on and set up WordPress or the application as normal. Let's go back into Azure and Kubernetes service and see exactly what we're looking at here. Again, we have an active solution, right? Here's the YAML create. And of course, you can monitor the events. Let's go into workloads. So you can see here, again, the WordPress SQL backend and the WordPress pod, the Apache pod and the SQL pod are configured and deployed. And you can see here they're one of one, so it's a one replica. What happens if you need to scale this out though? In this, this example, we're going to scale this out. It doesn't matter if it's on Anthos, it doesn't matter if it's on Karbon or any other cloud native Kubernetes solution that we support, such as OpenShift, etc. So let's go into the application lifecycle manager. And you can see here that we have two actions here. We have a scale in action and a scale out action. So the scale out action is actually configured to actually scale out one replica at a time. You can actually configure this to actually ask you how many replicas you want to scale out with a maximum number if you wanted. But for simplicity, we only have an automated solution that's set up right now for to scale out one replica at a time. So let's scale out the web tier and we'll run this. And we'll wait for this to finish, and I'll pause again for this to finish. Okay, so we can see the scale out action actually completed. It says it added replica. Let's see what that looks like. Let's go back to the application. Let's go to services. And now you can see that there's actually two pods, two for Apache and one for SQL. And let's go into the Azure portal and let's refresh this. And now you can see that the WordPress Apache has two pods. So we did a scale out action. We deployed the WordPress application, and then we scaled it out. And we can scale in. I don't think I need to show you that, but we can actually show you that later. In the next video, what I want to do is actually show you how we can tie the scaling and create an auto scaling function by using playbooks based on workload characteristics or time of day, etc. And we can see some of that automation happen natively within the solution. Okay, so let's summarize. You can see here within the application stack, we now have WordPress deployed on 3 different Kubernetes solutions. One Karbon, which is our native solution built into the platform. One Anthos, which we call a hybrid solution, where the actual Kubernetes solution, or the GKE cluster, is running on Nutanix hardware on-prem, but can be managed hybrid, either through our application automation stack or through the GCP portal using the Anthos and GKE sections of the portal. And of course, deploying the same application outside of Nutanix into a native cloud Kubernetes solution such as Azure Kubernetes Service. I hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to part 3, where we're actually going to show you how to tie in operations and auto scaling. Thank you.